When did we learn the first little elements of how to live a fully human life, a life in the etiquette that would be pleasing to ourselves and pleasing to others, a life that was lived under the guidance of God? Now, for most of us, those first elements of human living and etiquette were taught to us within our own family. As small children growing up within the family, it is our parents and perhaps our grandparents and wider members of the family who actually train our character, who make us aware of kindness, of generosity, of sharing, of seeking forgiveness, of remembering God before every action. And in this way, without our really being aware of it, our characters are being trained according to the way of God and according to the way of our families. And so it was when we think about Imam Hussain and his brother Imam Hussain, because the two young boys from their birth onwards were growing up in the prophetic household. They were constantly under the guidance of the prophet himself, who was training them in the way that they should operate, the way that they should think and act. And so we can see the influence that he had upon them when they were small children. So to understand Hussain the man, we need to go back to Hussain the small boy, growing up under the influence of the prophet in his own home. We know that the prophet always had a very close relationship with the two young boys when they were small. He loved to have them around him. He would often sit and play with them when they were small babies. And as they grew and were able to move around, he loved to have them with him, perhaps sitting in his lap. Sometimes we're told that he would be in the mosque and he would be giving a talk, and suddenly he would see the boys arrive and he would call them to him. And they would come forward and they would sit one on each knee, and they would remain there while he was speaking to the assembly. He called them, after the manner of the time, his sons, not his grandsons, but his sons. So close was the relationship, the proximity between the prophet and the two boys. We know that on one occasion, one of them crawled up onto his back when he was in prostration during prayer, and the prophet paused there until he had come high enough to be able to hold on to the prophet's shoulders, and then the prophet took his two hands, and when he came up, he held them so that he could ride his back after that for the rest of the prayer. Such was the closeness of the prophet and the two of them. Now, the prophet, of course, knew that these two were to be part of the Ahl al-Bayt, part of those who would succeed him after his own death and after their death of the father Ali, so that he was always having that in mind in training their characters, that they should be full of that zeal, full of that understanding, which was to be their duty and their vocation. Now, although the two boys were very small, they nevertheless have a very close relationship with God from the beginning, because their call to imamate begins from the very moment of their birth. They are filled with a spiritual excellence which brings them into a close relationship with God. This means that even incidents that happen when they're still quite young, have a profound influence and enable them to reflect and to learn from those in a way much quicker and much deeper than most of us would at that same age. So I want to look at two incidents in the early life of the two boys so that we can see something of their character in the process of formation. I want to look at the incident of the thorough purification of the Ahl al-Bayt. We're told that the Prophet was wrapped in a large cloak or a blanket, and then he called under that cloak successively Ali, Fatima, Hassan, and Hussein, so that these five were together under the blanket. Now, the boys were quite small at this time, and yet they were aware that they were drawn into this familial embrace under the blanket. And then the verse of the Quran was revealed that Allah wished to purify the Ahl al-Bayt, the household of the Prophet, with the most thorough purification. Now, only God can thoroughly purify to the ultimate degree, because only God is ultimately pure, is ultimately the highest of spiritual excellence. In this case, then, the two boys, even though they were small, were aware of a kind of spiritual infusion, a lifting of their souls in this divine embrace. Now, I'm sure that as they grew up, Ali and Fatima would have helped them to understand the importance of this experience and the fact that these five are the kernel of the Ahl al-Bayt, and that the children of this family going down through the generations will be the leaders of the community, the leaders of the community divinely appointed by God. Another event that I want to look at, and this is an event that took place shortly before the death of the Prophet. It was the event of the visit of the delegation from Najran. Here was a Christian delegation who came to Medina to engage with the Prophet in conversation about the person of Jesus. They did not manage to resolve their differences, and in the end, a verse of the Quran was revealed, which was commanding them to mubahala, to mutual cursing before God. And so they were to appear, the two groups, in the next morning and to invoke the curse of God upon whichever one of them was not telling the truth. They were commanded to bring ourselves, our women, and our sons. When the Prophet appeared for the mubahala, he came with Ali, whom he referred to as his nafs, or his very self, and he came with Fatima, his daughter, the mother of the two boys, and he came with Hassan and Hussein. So the five of them appeared together, and at this, the Christian delegation, we're told, decided that it would not be a good idea to take on in mutual cursing the Prophet and his immediate family. Because if the Prophet was prepared to risk the whole of his immediate family in this mutual cursing, then clearly they said this was not something into which we should go. And again we can see that the two boys would be questioning their father Ali later on, wanting to know what all this was about, wanting to gain a deeper understanding and insight into what happened. After the death of the Prophet, and shortly afterwards, the death of the mother of the two boys, Lady Fatima, it was Ali who became the most important influence in the life of the two young boys. Now, Ali, we know, also grew up in the shadow of the Prophet. He was the closest to him throughout those years growing up. He was modeling his life on the Prophet. And we know that the Quran tells us, you have in the Prophet the most beautiful example of how a godly life should be lived. So Ali models his life upon the perfect example of the Prophet, and Ali then becomes the trainer of the characters of the two boys. In addition to this, Ali was of course aware that he had been called to be the successor of the Prophet, to be his brother, and to be the executor of his will. And now Ali's perception and understanding of his role was increased. And so he was the agent of the Prophet in many good deeds, in distributing charity, in going to those who were poor, who were oppressed in some way. He also was, of course, a great warrior. And so we see in Ali this dimension of nobility and chivalry in his character too. One final part of the character of Ali that we need to understand is that he is not only the scribe of the Quran, taking it down in writing from the lips of the Prophet himself, but also the Prophet is explaining to him the meaning of the verses, those meanings which are clearly there and those meanings which are hidden. He is also aware of the occasions of the revelation of each of the verses in the Quran. So the Quran lives in the heart of Ali in a very special way. Now, when Ali then comes to train the character of these two sons, we can see that all these elements are poured into their characters as they are growing up. So Ali trains them in chivalry, in nobility, in acts of warfare, of courage, of standing their ground against an enemy. We can see that Ali is also training them to understand the inner dimensions of the Quran, to understand those verses which are not clear in their meaning, to understand the way in which one must interact with the text of the Quran to draw out its full meaning so that one can pass it on to others. We see also that Ali is passing on to them this profound understanding that it is their responsibility to work with the poorest, the disadvantaged, those who are hungry within the community, so that charity becomes a second nature to them. And in this way, as they grow to maturity, the two boys become images of the character of Ali, who is himself the image of the character of the Prophet, and who is the best example of how to live the message of the Quran in everyday life. And therefore we can see that they are characters of the very highest importance of purity and spiritual excellence before they enter the threshold of manhood.